So I have a lot of work planned for this year, and most of that is going to be done on the lathe. But before I kick into high gear, there are a few things that I'd like to address with the lathe. Better I do it now when I have a bit of free time, and I can then have the lathe ready to go for the year. This is probably the most common thing that I get asked about the machine. Pretty much, why is it so loud? And that is a fair thing to ask. For the price that I paid, I couldn't be happier with the machine, except for the gearbox noise. Now, I'm pretty sure it's mostly down to the fact that there isn't a whole lot of mass to contain the gear noise, and spur gears, which is what this machine uses, are probably the loudest type of meshing gears that you can find. And at least for what it's worth, I've used 3 different Hafco branded lathes over the years, all of them with very similar gearboxes to this one, and they were all incredibly loud. So this isn't an isolated problem with this lathe. With that said though, the noises have recently gotten a lot worse, so I need to get into the gearbox and see if anything's gone wrong. And whilst I'm going to do that, I'll also check the overall condition of the gearbox. Alright, so I've gotten the top cover ripped off the gearbox, and just going by looks, there's nothing that's immediately jumping out at me as being an issue. It looks pretty much the same as it looked last time, although the oil that is sitting in there is going to need draining again. It seems to be full of grit and dust, and that needs to be removed. However, upon doing a closer inspection, I can definitely feel that there is some slack in the spacing between the gears and the spacers. And judging by the noise that I'm hearing here, that is very similar to some of the noises that I'm hearing in the gearbox when it's running. And no doubt, this is not the only case of that being an issue in this gearbox. Although finding a fix for this is going to have to wait for another day, because I'll probably have to pull apart the entire gearbox, and that is going to be a multi-week project. But this still doesn't explain the sudden increase in noise that I'm hearing, so I will need to look elsewhere. And it seems I didn't have to look too far, because as I was taking the belts off the motor, it became pretty apparent that there was absolutely nothing holding the motor pulley in place except for the key. I do apologise for that, I've been watching too many reruns of Home Improvement, but yet that could certainly be an issue, and that is probably the source of the sound. Now thankfully, once I got the pulley off, there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of damage to the pulley, but there is definitely some fetting corrosion to the motor shaft, which thankfully cleaned up quite easily. Now as it turns out, the reason for all of this is a missing screw, which is supposed to hold everything in place. I'm not exactly sure if they've forgotten to add the grub screw at the factory and the wobble in the pulley has slowly gotten worse over time, or if the grub screw has simply worked itself loose. But for what it's worth, I can't find any loose grub screws in the motorbox. Either way though, a new screw held in with some Loctite should be a good fix. And the moment of truth. Okay, well it hasn't gotten that much better, but it has eliminated the new rattling that I was hearing. So at least in one respect, that is mission accomplished. As I said, one day hopefully I am going to pull the gearbox apart and see if I can fix it, but today is not that day. Now this will be the 3rd time that I've changed the oil in the lathe, and it never gets any easier given where they've placed the drain port. But judging by the oil, it was certainly due for it. I'll now pour in some kerosene to clean any remaining oil or grit in the gearbox, and I'll run the lathe for a minute or so. I'll then top it up with some oil and that should be good to go. I've also ordered a magnetic drain port, so when that arrives I'll probably put that in too. With that now sorted, let's move on to problem number 2. Now serie rests are usually pretty good pieces of kit to have with your lathe, if they are well made, but unfortunately this one isn't. Problem number 1. I used the serie rest once and that was enough to almost chew through one of the bearing pads, which isn't supposed to happen. This one here uses a bearing surface rather than ball bearings to support the material, and whilst you do expect it to wear, it's not supposed to wear this much that quickly. And I'm almost certain it's because they've cheaped out and they've used the wrong material as the bearing surface. I'm 99% sure that what we have here is brass, which is okay under light loads, but under heavy loads it does tend to work harden and shred quite quickly. What they should have used was bearing bronze, but bearing bronze is going to be a lot more expensive, so I can see why they've cheaped out. Normally I just replace the bearing surfaces with proper bronze, but instead what I'm going to try here is to replace the whole assembly and use ball bearings. But before I can do any of that, I need to first fix the frame, because there is so much slop in the frame, it's nearly impossible to properly set it up in a rigid manner. And that is quite obviously the problem. The hole that they've drilled is about 1mm too big for the pin. So the hole is a pretty good fit on a 6mm drill bit, so I'll simply make up a new fit to fit tightly inside of it. And that's the top half fitting on quite well. And that is the same story for the bottom. And that's the new pin. And that all goes together quite well, except there is still a fair amount of movement in the assembly. And thankfully the issue is not that big, it's all down to that slot being about 0.5mm oversized. Now I couldn't find a washer to fit in the gap, so I'll have to go ahead and make my own spacer. And that's just about solved it. It definitely feels a lot more solid and rigid. Overall, good stuff. So with that done, let's get the ball bearing rollers made. And naturally, these are going to require new roller bodies to be made. I'll then drill a 7mm hole for the right hand M8 thread. The pass came out looking really nice, so I'll take it over to the mill and cut in a channel for the grub screw and a slot for the ball bearing. In terms of bearings, I'm going to use these ones that I have here. They've been in the bottom of a drawer for a few years now, and they should be good enough for the job. And that's a nice fit for the ball bearing. The final thing it needs is a shaft for the bearings to sit on, and I could have turned those down on the lathe quite easily, but broken end mill shanks are already ground down to size, and quite frankly, I already have a lot of them on hand. And I think those came out looking quite nice if you ask me. And thankfully the steady rest works quite well with this new ball bearing rollers. Except this presents me with yet another issue, which I seem to have missed the first time round. And that's that the holes which are used to keep the rollers aligned are drilled wildly off centre, and as a result, that's pushing the bearings off at an angle. Now sometimes I can give the people who make this lathe a little bit of slack, but if I'm quite honest, that is a really poor job. I mean, that is really far off centre. But complaining won't fix the issue, so let's go ahead and try to fix it. Now thankfully, because they drilled the top hole so wildly off centre, I can simply find the centre of the hole and simply drill a new one. So I guess in one respect, it's actually pretty good that they did a really bad job. I'll fill the old hole with a grub screw, and when the time comes to repaint the steady rest, I can simply fill the old hole in. Unfortunately though, the other hole is only slightly off centre, so I can't just go in and tap another M6 hole. So I think the way to fix this is to drill the whole section out and then tap it for a threaded insert. And because there is so much stick out here, before I do any drilling, I'll support the whole steady rest with a jack stand. And finally, that is the steady rest done. Well, mostly. I did manage to lose the whole T-nut assembly halfway through making it, but I think for everyone's sanity, well, mostly mine, I'm going to have to move this project along. Now this upgrade is not a huge one, but it's one that's definitely worth it to me. I'm always losing the keys to the drill chucks, but what I have here is a small holder which I ripped off an old drill press. All it needs is simply to be screwed into place. And now the chuck here is always in reach. It's definitely a small upgrade, but at least to me, it's definitely one that's worth it. And moving on to our final part, this isn't an upgrade per se, but it needs to be done. I recently got around to buying a 4-jaw chuck for the lathe. This isn't the final one that I want to stick with long term. You know, I would like a larger one down the road, but this one is going to do for the moment. The thing is though, whilst the spindle nose and the chuck are the same size, I can't actually bolt the chuck onto the spindle. The 3-jaw has 3 bolts, as does the spindle nose, but the 4-jaw has 4 holes. Now obviously I'd rather not risk drilling into the hardened spindle in order to add new holes, so what I'll need to do here is make a backplate to effectively act as an adapter to bolt the 4-jaw onto the spindle. Now according to the internet, I need to use cast iron as my spindle backplates. I'm not exactly sure why, but long story short, getting a piece of 130mm diameter cast iron cut to the length that I need is a lot easier said than done. So instead, I've opted for a piece of 1045. It should be a lot tougher than the mild steel that I normally use, and definitely a lot stronger. The first thing I need to do is turn down the rough surface left by the bandsaw at the metal shop. Not a perfect finish by any means, but it is certainly a lot better than before. I now need to drill out the centre to let long material pass through the chuck and the backplate. I'll first start off by drilling a pilot hole. I'll then move up to a 25mm Deming bit. And I'll use the air coolant here to keep the drill bit as cool as possible. Now the finish left by the drill bit was a bit ordinary, so I'll clean it up with a boring bar. With that now done, I'll use the boring bar to cut the register that'll seat the spindle onto the backplate. And it's really important that I get this step pretty much spot on. And thankfully that is a really good fit. I can't feel any movement between the spindle and the backplate. Overall, good stuff. I'll now get it bolted onto the milling machine table and get the holes drilled for the bolts. And what I'm aiming for here is 4 counterboard M8 holes to hold the chuck on and 3 tapped holes to hold the backplate onto the spindle. Finally, I'll get the backplate mounted onto the spindle and I'll cut the final register and get the outside turned down to size. And once again, that is a really good fit between the backplate and the chuck. The final thing left to do is mark out the orientation in which I've mounted all this, so I can always mount it in this way. It helps eliminate any run out or error in the spindle bearings or the spindle nose. And now that I have a new chuck on, I guess let's go ahead and test it. So So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a tool that I've been meaning to make for a while. And if you couldn't already guess what I was making, it's an adapter for a cordless drill, which allows me to very easily move in and out the chuck jaws. All in all, for a very inexpensive 4-jaw chuck, it works pretty well. And that's about it for now. The lathe should be good to go until the end of the year, or at least until I next decide to completely tear it down, which being me could be effectively never, or 2 weeks from now. Thanks for watching. See you next time.